So good afternoon, everyone. So I am in a great difficulty to synthesize a broader, voluminous bunch of Aurobindo's thinking on Indian culture, which is not a possibility. I mean, in a straightforward manner. So, but let me put a context to it. The first caveat that I wanted to do is, see, we must realize that Aurobindo was writing in the period where there is certain kind of conversation existed, certain ways in which people used language. There are terms that he wrote it in English. If you would have written it in Indian languages or Bengali, it would have been very different. Because, for example, he wrote about the will, consciousness, and then, religion. I mean, these terms today carry completely different kind of meaning, 1 century later today. So we have to keep that. But nonetheless, he gives an account of what does he mean. In various occasions, when he is using the term, he gives a clear-cut understanding of how he is using these terms. So that would help us in terms of reading his accounts without getting into this problem of wordplay, and really get into the kind of phenomena that he is interested in bringing it to our account. So given that caveat, so I have taken it for granted that when, for example, when he writes about religion, he is talking about traditions that exist, multiplicity of traditions. I mean, this is the spirit within which I actually read, Aurobindo's work. Now, to be very honest with you, the question would be, why would we think about Aurobindo's ideas of Indian culture? And that too in the context of the way title suggests, looking at Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, this requires some kind of a clarification before I get into the detail, because this would also set what kind of a project such a project is, and why I am interested in engaging with such a project. Now, so today you hear this term Atmanirbhar Bharat because the current ruling dispensation, uses this word Atmanirbhar Bharat for various things, and it today, for whatever reason, wrongly or rightly, gets identified with certain kind of development and progress. It's about bringing science and technology, investment, etc. Now this could be necessary part of the 21st century, the geopolitically charged world to be participating in it. But would these kind of initiatives that we are now discussing in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat would make India Atmanirbhar? Now, if you actually pitch in such a question, now one could have technology, one could have highest advancement in science, you could have extraordinary material wealth. We have witnessed in our history that when you have excellence in terms of your intellectual growth, excellence in terms of accumulation of wealth, you have succumbed to the foreign forces, you have been subjugated. I mean, history is witness to such account. So therefore, if you want to reflect on Atmanirbhar Bharat, there is a certain particular way in which you should look at the human lives. And the way the human life, some of these questions, I think it is important that we must go back to some of these great scholars, our ancestors, who are our predecessors, to think and reflect about our own selves today. And one of the definitive character in this is Aurobindo. And my encounter with Aurobindo is probably more than 2 decades old. But when I started academically reading Aurobindo a little more than a decade back because of one of my students, Harshit Joseph, there was a point in time I actually gave up because the kind of English which is there is not easy stuff to deal with. Now, after many years, I came back for various other reasons and looked at it. So today's talk, I will be focusing on one particular kind of a work, which I think forms a very, very foundational way in which actually you could think about how Indian culture should be conceptualized, what do we learn from it, whether that connects with my very being in this world. What he spoke a century back would help us to make sense of what I am today. Now, what kind of a project it is to discover myself as part of a member of an Indian culture, or generally anybody who wants to know about Indian culture, what would be the means? And second, now, even if you want to reflect more deeply about Atmanirbhar Bharat, today if you look at the kind of socio-political issues that India has been confronting, see, it is not the GDP, it is not the economic growth. There are other kind of social problems which are actually haunting Indian tradition today. Now, it was not anymore the Garibi Hatao slogans which are going to play a significant role, but something else of a different kind which is actually disturbing our society today. Now, there are all kinds of people who take different kinds of position about this, but how do we reflect about the problems that are confronted by 21st century world, and is there anything that we can learn from Aurobindo's question? In order to address this, I first came to Aurobindo's work way back, a decade back, because of my guru, Professor S.N. Balgangadhara. See, one of the claims that S.N. Balgangadhara was making is that if someone says that my theories about understanding both Europe and India are meaningful, they make sense to people, it cannot be an accident that I came to this. They must have been predecessors to this. And these ideas that people have reflected, developed, which would have, their failures and success would have gone into developing this project, without which overnight somebody cannot come and say that I have a theory to offer. So in that sense, there is nothing original that you can think of. There is always a progression. Of course, there will be bigger leaps that people could take because your predecessors have done. In that sense, you should go and look for people who have actually examined what kind of routes that they have taken. And this is the context within which we actually looked at Aurobindo Ghosh's work. Now, in one of his book, I'm going to focus on only one of that book, which actually makes it extraordinarily fascinating for all of us to examine, which is something that has not been adequately addressed, even when it has been examined, has not been done with due respect to the kind of work that it is. Now, I wanted to take that. And this book is, in his complete works, you have this volume, Renaissance India, or The Defense of Indian Culture. Now, earlier, some parts of it was published in the name of Foundations of Indian Culture. Now, if you look at the current version that is available as part of the complete works, it is a series of essays about Renaissance India, and then you have Is India Civilized, and then you have Defense of Indian Culture, Rational Critique of Indian Culture, and then you have a series of essays on spirituality and India, and then you have certain essays on language and literature, and a range of things. Now, this context to this entire book, The Defense of Indian Culture, there is a very interesting editorial note which actually tells us that Aurobindo wanted to rewrite that whole work. So he wanted to edit, he wanted to remove certain parts of it, he wanted to reduce, emphasize on different parts of it, but unfortunately it never happened. So therefore, after his demise, this whole work has been published in the way it is, but certainly he wanted to actually take a relook at it. In that sense that there was already some kind of a development of thinking about what constitutes Indian culture, etc. is very interesting. It's an oblique way, it's a comparative way, but it's a very, very fascinating way to learn about Indians and our culture. Now, the context of this book, a very central part of this book, is this book which comes in 1917 by this guy called Archer. He was a scholar who published India and Its Future, one of this book, and there was some kind of an evaluation about Indian art, Indian literature, Indian aesthetics, Indian sculpture. I mean, all that was evaluated in 1917. Apparently, this book was written way back in 1912. In 17, this got published. And by then, there was a response to this book. Some of the people who were sympathizers of Indian tradition, people like John Woodrow, for example, were terribly upset with the kind of work, and they made a lot of rebuttals to this kind of work. Now, both John Woodruff and all other contemporaries who were thinking about Indian culture, etc., Aurobindo actually takes up Archer's criticism and he examines them. So he examines them in 5-part essays, which is towards the rational critique of Indian culture, wherein he keeps on looking at how, for example, Westerners and Archer actually criticizes religion of India, and then the philosophy of India, the life of the ordinary people, and the nature of the morality of Indian people, nature of the science and technology, etc. And he takes them, each one of them in greater detail, and tries to look at it. And there is something very phenomenally interesting about this kind of criticism, which is something which demands actually a very careful and very attentive and a subtle kind of a reading of this text. See, on the outset, if you actually look at how he treats the critique, okay, so there is this one author about which he is preoccupied. Now, that is how it appears if you read the text. And it appears that this guy is writing in a journalistic piece. He does not have understanding of Samskrita. He does not have this. It appears that any one of us who are very frustrated today, somebody says anything against India, our first reaction would be saying he's anti-India. This kind of it appears on the outset that Aurobindo is very upset about this kind of a criticism, very demeaning criticism of India, and there is some kind of a devolved Indian who wanted to defend it. But actually, to be very honest with you, if you read it very critically, now there is something very extraordinary, fascinating, two important things that emerges out of the critique that he is trying to build. The first and foremost, though he is actually looking at, in the writings that if you look at it, he is looking at the demeaning criticism of India developed by one person, Archer. And he is also comparing that there are also other great people. He talks about Spinoza, he talks about Christ, he talks about so many other scholars. And he also looks at he evaluates various other scholars, including Rudyard Kipling to, many others, and how they looked at India, how they understood. And it appears like he is actually saying some kind of Westerners have some kind of a conspiracy against the Indian kind. Now that is how it appears in the text if you read it. But then there are points where suddenly he makes a shift, which is something that most of the readers miss out, and which is one of the most crucial part for our project. Now he says that when you actually look at Archer's criticism of what is happening, now one should not look at actually Archer as a person, but it actually speaks to you about the European mind. Now, this one person's criticism, so he goes on further. In subsequent essays, it becomes a very central theme in a very subtle fashion. It becomes a recurrent theme, even though he is addressing one person who is actually developing a criticism. He is actually saying that, look, there are people who could actually write positively about India. There could also be people who could write even more demeaningly to India. But the question is not about whether they write positively or negatively, but rather it is the question of how European mind conceptualizes. In fact, he uses the specific word, how Occidental mind conceptualizes the Oriental way of being in this world. Now, there is something very peculiar about this Occidental mind. There is a particular way in which the Westerners would look at India and her tradition. He goes on and here and there, which might deviate you from the central point, but the central theme remains is, even though he is looking at, he has a great appreciation to any number of scholars, starting from Christ to Saint Augustine to Saint Anselm to even Spinoza. He has appreciation to all of them, yet he has been very categorical in recognizing this way of looking at another culture as not as a problem of one person individual. And he is also trying to make this a very significant point in saying that what he is pointing out, what Archer is saying, is not simply about whether demeaning or saying something positive about India. It is fundamental question about how one culture understands another culture. Just because somebody said something positive does not make it great, or somebody saying demeaning does not make it good or bad. So in that sense, there is a first significant question that emerges in the Aurobindo's critique, which is when Europeans look at India. Now, how do they look at India? Now, irrespective of whether they look at it positively or whether they look at negatively, with great sympathy or without sympathy towards Indian culture, there is a fundamental difficulty in the way in which the West looks at the Eastern culture becomes the first significant problem, which becomes the recurrent theme throughout the whole book. It also becomes an emergent point in other writings on the culture. But somehow this does not get picked up by the later kind of work. I mean, this becomes a very, very crucial part in saying that he recognizes there is this point. And the second important point that he also starts recognizing as early, because this responses began way back in 1919 onwards. By then he has already started recognizing that the Europeans came and told about India so many things. Right? They said about there are many good things, they said there are bad things. They said, for example, for many people saying India is very, very great in metaphysics and spirituality. A range of scholars have said. And then said, but they're childlike in all other things. Right? So there is a way in which the Indian mind started actually buying this story. So a large number of people over a period of time, it has become common sense among large number of the Orientals. He is not just limiting it to Indians, he is calling it Asiatic. A large number of Asians seem to be getting this idea. So there is something which is very problematic that he recognizes. He does not say that the Indian people are unthinking. He is not saying they are not intelligent enough, but there is something at play which is actually making them to subscribe to this story. So therefore, his project actually becomes an intersection of character. It is at the intersection where he wants to characterize this problem, saying why, for example, Europeans look at India in a particular way, be it positive or negative. This is the first aspect of the question that Aurobindo was preoccupied with. I think it is one of the more fascinating, and I will come back and tell you why it is extremely fascinating. And the second important point that he was raising, now he takes the question of the sculpture, he takes this question of the art forms, he takes the question of literature, he takes the question of language. He even has a great length discussion between the Homeric poetry versus Kalidasa. So there is, I will not get into the details of the quotations and the citations. But with all that, he could actually able to show that first the Europeans had a deficient way of looking at it. There is something which is very problematic. This he calls the continental misunderstanding of the cultures. Right? So there is something that kind of thing is happening. And the upcoming generations of Indians seem to be actually buying this. And they're actually owning this as some kind of a truth of this world. Now, if you look at this as this is the story that I am talking about, the book which emerged, the articles which emerged between 1919 to 1920. This is the point in time where this was the first part of the characterization of the Indian culture begins. I will come back to the other aspects of it. Now, in 1978, we hit another very important scholar, now Edward Said, right? He became a very significant scholar in the post-colonial scholarship. He still tops the imagination of the post-colonial scholarship today. What was Said's contribution there? If you read it, one of the most important thing in the Arab world, what Said recognizes, is that Westerners, over a period in time, over centuries, different nationalities from Europe came and saw Orient, independent of whether they are French, Britain, German, whatever they are, they actually experienced and understood West. In fact, he goes on to say, Orient is an invention of European culture. And Orient was a necessity for the European culture. There is a particular way in which actually Occident looks at the Orient. He says, if you look at the way in which the Europeans look at the world, now what you understand is it doesn't tell you anything about the Orient, even though they have come and walked and lived, they did all whatever they could do, but it tells you more about the Euro-Atlantic culture. It tells you more about the power and their domination. This is the very significant part of the larger project of Edward Said that he was saying. And he also recognized this point today, that the Orient is in crisis because Orientals themselves are Orientalizing the Orient. This was the formulation by the Edward Said. Now, if you look and go back almost 80 years before, or 60, 70 years before, here is our man who was looking at it. But then Edward Said's project has led to some kind of a disaster that all we know. It has become kind of, it has developed a hatred towards the Europe. So it is calling everything Eurocentric, racist, sexist, all that, you wanted to label for Europe. And all that the stories of Europe had told about India was actually smuggled and then sold as the post-colonial story. So you have the same, there is nothing that has dramatically changed on ground in looking at by the post-colonialism. No, but what Aurobindo was trying to point out, for example, I will take a couple of examples and then try to sort of demonstrate what was the point that he was trying to say, which today we can develop. During the period when Aurobindo was writing, such data was not available. Today it is a challenge that we can deal with, and it's very important for our future. One of the very important thing, in few lines he finishes his comments, which are very powerful. He said, for example, if Archer thinks about how Archer thinks about the science and technology in India. Now, so one of the important things that Aurobindo recognizes there is that his characterization of science and technology cannot be anything that is truth that existed in the world. That we know what kind of science and technology Indians have produced at that point in time. But now, then also, there is a problem saying that it is not alone that there is no science and technology, it appears to be very primitive, it is halted at some point in time, etc. But for Archer, Indian culture and Indian people appeared very superstitious. They are full of myths and they are not very serious, they are immoral, whole range of other things. But then today, if you take Aurobindo's critique seriously and look at any one of the domain and then see whether what Aurobindo was responding to Archer makes any sense or not. Now today we have a lot of archival data, for instance, to look at how Indians manage science and technology. One of the, for example, to give you one of the easily accessible source which you guys can go back and refer to is the work of Science and Technology by Dharampal. How was the science and technology prevalent in India? Now, there is something extraordinary about it. Everyone uses that book to say that India also had science and technology. I think that is really sort of showing disrespect to what Dharampal was trying to push, or what, for that matter, not understanding what Aurobindo was trying to actually critique and look at it. See, if you look at one of the example is the inoculation practices that existed in India way back in 15th, 16th century until 17th century, where British came and prohibited these inoculation practices in the eastern India and later the whole of India. Now, how was it happening? Now, suddenly at some point in time, in the beginning of the summer, some Brahmins from the Banaras used to walk out to different parts of the country. And there was one branch will go to, from Banaras to Bengal, another branch go to another part. These are certain families who are professionally involved in this process, they go. And what do they go? There are already people who know where, incidents of certain chicken pox or certain kind of infectious diseases exist. And these guys carry certain things. There is a setup, there is a kind of relationship that they carried. And they developed inoculation material, carried germs, and then came back every year. The details of what was the process, how was the inoculation done, what is the process that was involved, etc. is available now publicly. Anybody can go and read. But something extraordinary about it. What is extraordinary about it? There is no Raja who could actually come and stop these people to go and do their traditional practice. Nor no government gave them funding saying, I am giving you money, do this research. Now, Raja could give them the grant and tell them you pursue science. Now, you can't dictate term of what kind of science you have to do. Second, there was no one kingdom or one Raja who controlled the technology. Not alone that, the technology was not even in the hands of one community. No, it was distributed. Different processes of the same technology was distributed practically across whole range of communities. Whether you extend this idea to metallurgy, whether you any other technological forms. So what you consider to be various jati, biradari, various organization, they would, in a ritual process, they would end up completing the whole process. So therefore, there was no possibility of monopolizing any science and technology by any one group or a community. There is no possibility of monopoly over one geographic region. No, region is not possible. Third, that no political authority could dictate what should be the direction of the scientific development. Now, therefore, there is something extraordinary about it. See, today, come back in the 21st century. Now look at our Indian universities and academic institutions. One of the problems for knowledge production in Indian institution is ideologues control the institutions. Now you are not free to pursue the kind of research you want to pursue. There are certain kind of agenda, certain kind of ideas are allowed. Certain companies, certain institutions, state allows you to do it. And there is practically and absolutely free. So this is what Aurobindo uses the word, the freedom of the spirit. So there was an absolute freedom to pursue the kind of path that one would want to. And each of them, I will come back to the next crucial step that Sampadananji already in the beginning itself, they are connected to certain higher ideals of the world. Now you could actually integrate, because Aurobindo takes this question, saying if you want to actually make an assessment of a culture, you should actually make an assessment of a culture separately on the basis of the higher order thinking as well as the life of the ordinary. Now, by looking at just the corpus of writing, you can't judge whether the culture functions in that way or not. Or by looking at the way they function, you can't judge whether they have a higher order thinking or not. In fact, one of the most beautiful things about Indian culture that Aurobindo would argue is that whatever deeper reflection that philosophically that existed were actually not just translated into certain practical way of being the ordinary. Now, there was a tremendous possibility of these ordinary men and women who are doing all kinds of jobs, the trivial to the extraordinary, to pursue the paths that they wanted to pursue. There was no dogma. In fact, there was no doctrinal inhibitions to do anything. In fact, there is a very critical reflection in one of this rational critic, probably fourth part of the essay, where he's saying, how can you have one kind of a social law for the whole country? How can you have 2 or 3 set of doctrines to dictate, so much of free living spirits in the world? Not possible. Therefore, one of the extraordinary beauty of this Indian culture, as opposed to in the contradistinction, why Europeans understood this way, because they were predetermined, where he explicitly says that they were actually trying to understand and model the world in according to the doctrines of the Christianity. He's not condemning that Christianity good or bad or whatever. He's saying that is what their experience, and they are trying to actually look at the world in that way, but India was not that. For them, the way the Indians existed was superstitious, idolatrous, false religious. You name all that, polytheism, all that are considered to be derogatory, that you think that any people should not have, is India. That is what you label as Hinduism. But on the contrary, this way of being had to be but natural, because the oldest civilization has done experiment, not simply writing some books and making people to follow the book. But it is this deeper reflection of thinking about it, writing about it, and then transmitting the practical of the ordinary. This is Aurobindo's word. Now, this practical of the ordinary, the pragmatic way of being in this world, has to come from an entirely different way of being in this world which cannot be comprehended. Now, it is very crucial. I gave you 2 examples. That the science and technology was conceptualized. I gave you 1 example. If you want, you can do this assignment and have hundreds of examples to illustrate that. Today we have huge amount of archival data that shows you that, whether the institutions of the kind that we have today regulated science and technology. No. There was absolute freedom to pursue what they wanted to. Now, not just that it was impossible to monopolize anything in science and technology. Knowledge could not be monopolized. Right? On the contrary, second, there was freedom to exist in this world given the local to all kinds of conditions. So there is this practical way of being. Whether it is yoga, whether it is the high-level philosophy, is about the practical way of being. As she rightly pointed out, it is the world of action. So which in our research we call it as performative traditions. Everything is performance, you do it. So everything that you have, the higher ideal, so the pursuit of the deeper happiness, ananda, that we put it in Indian tradition, is not a matter of some kind of a lecture for the ordinary being. It is a way of being, and it is the pursuit which actually determines your daily life and action. Now, if you come back, look at the archival data, you would realize in the village, for example, there were people who were fighting the wars in the war field. And when war was happening, there were people who were plowing their land. Now, people who are plowing the land are not affected by what is happening in the battlefield. So there was a very interesting incident to give you, which changed the Gandhi's life. When Gandhi was apparently traveling in one part of the Kerala, he was trying to meet the king of the Travancore. And as usual, Gandhi is Gandhi. He stops his car on the way amidst the paddy field and then asks somebody that, who is your king? And the answer is, koi to hoga. How does it matter? Because the Raja come and go. It is of a different function. The conception of the Raja, the way in which your politics existed, the way your practical life is connected are completely different than the way the Europeans have conceptualized it. Now, it is so important today, in 21st century, where we are standing today, where me and you are part of academic institutions, we are part of the modern Indian state, which is the continuation of the colonial state. We are here. Now, all the assumption about the nature of human being, what a human being should do, should not do, is determined by what Europeans conceptualized it for themselves in their culture. Second, we have another kind of people, very free living people. Now, all our policies, whether you wanted to get water in the villages, whether you wanted to ensure, education access, whether you wanted to give health access, all these policies are fundamentally determined by certain conceptions, certain understanding, certain knowledge of the human beings. And this part of the world that we live in has a completely alternative conception of existing in this world, being in this world. Now, if you don't take the route that the Aurobindo proposed, which my guru also formulates in a much larger theoretical framework, and saying when you are looking at these institutions, when you are looking at the individual critics, etc., it is important to understand them today as European culture, which has actually determined not just the social sciences about our policy framework, everything that it determines. We should ask this question in distinction to them, how different are we? We must also in between realize that there is something at the level of consciousness that actually disturbs us, that we carry those stories about ourselves, which is not part of my experience, but whatever Europeans have told 200 years back, we keep parroting as the scientific truth about ourselves as human beings. Now, from there, if you want to make a deflection and actually decide, and if you want to really become self-reliant, the translation of Atmanirbhar, if we want to do that, now, one of the very important things is to create this contrast project and look at the differences. And already there was a mention that Aurobindo emphasized on looking at these differences and also how to deal with the differences. Differences is a very natural part of our very human existence, not just Indian, in every part of the world. And there is a particular way in which you deal with the differences. And Indian culture, being the ancient civilization, has learned to deal with these differences of all kinds. Psychological, sociological, biological, cultural. All kinds of differences have been dealt with. In a very critical detail, I think it's important for us to separate among our daily conversation, among our policy initiative, among our academic enterprise, what suits us and what is not suiting us. We need to make this distinction very clear and start building an alternative world of what kind of a different people are we. Now, if you don't conceptualize that way, because you keep cribbing today, that you go to any science institution, top science institution in the country, you go, either you say that the state does not fund you properly for your scientific enterprise, or you say there are certain companies which actually monopolize, what should come as an outcome. You have all kinds of story. But there is a completely alternative structure. Now, what is that structure? Is saying that kings cannot enter and dictate terms to what should happen. Nobody has monopoly over knowledge. In fact, there are systems that are built to break the monopoly. There was no possibility. And this way of doing is a practical knowledge, transmitting this practical knowledge of doing scientific enterprise. Now, the question that we must be asking, taking this question, that how do we do it within the 21st century world that we live in. Now, we can't go back to 16th century and 17th century, impossible. But there is something extraordinary that we must learn. And the only way that we can think of doing it is this recognition that we must find out. That when we look at people, when they talk about India, when we look at the policy framework, now we must look at them, these policy framework are part of the conceptualization of one particular kind of human being which we are not. And simply making this as a claim that we are not that kind of a human being does not help anybody. So what kind of a human being we are and what kind of a human being we are not is something that needs to be characterized. And there comes this critique, defense of Indian culture, where what gets formulated as some kind of a structure, the beginning of a journey that he was giving a call. Now, it is very disheartening to know that after a century of that work, we are just thinking that, we wanted to address that call that he has given. I think it is high time that we should actually use some of this as an alternative paradigms, alternative ways of looking at, how do we reclaim ourselves and how do we rebuild institutions based on our experiences, our ethos of this world. I gave you a couple of examples. There are much more. Some of the practical version of it, some of the people in the Rishihood has witnessed some of the experiments that we are trying to do in the villages, in the self-governance, etc. There is a call for doing practical. The practical has to be backed up with sound reasoning, sound academic engagement. And there was this call which was given a century back, more than a century back. And I think it is important that we should come back to that. In that sense, this Indian culture cannot be reduced to some kind of a semantic claim of 10 sentences or 15 sentences. This is not. It's a way of being in this world. It's a very practical way of existing in this world, and that needs to be theorized adequately. Now, the only way that we can pursue that today, more and more seriously in the way that Aurobindo was formulating, is saying that it has to be a comparative project. Because half of the stories that have been sold on us as our stories are not our stories. There are all kinds of stories in the marketplace, so we have to categorize them. Just because somebody comes and praises us doesn't mean that it is true description of us. Or just because somebody comes and says something very negative or demeaning about us doesn't mean that it is really a bad story about us. One needs to think about how do we build a rational critique of a culture, which are the titles of the essays written by the Aurobindo. Now, if we go in that way, this very practical way of being, the human, the conception of a human that Aurobindo was proposing, if we put it in the 21st century language, I think there is an extraordinary possibility to move forward. The alternative possibilities of institution, social law, there are a whole range of issues. So we are confronted now very quickly the UCC debate. How do we deal with it? I think there is extraordinary answers which we can find. So with that, I have, with due apologies that I have made this more towards the academic side than with lesser example. But nonetheless, the project calls for us to engage it more at the level of thought, which I thought is appropriate for today's discussion. With that note, I close my remarks. Thank you very much.